Hannah Calloway did not step back when the men along the sail ring turned around to look at her. She had 29 days to gather 240 head of cattle off open range and load them on the last stock train out of Hackberry Wells. She had $1,400 owing on a note her husband had signed in 1882 and had not lived long enough to pay. And she had that morning exactly one sound saddle horse, an old bay pony with a splint on his near foreleg the size of a hen's egg. So when Marsh Kettleman leaned over the top rail of the ring and asked the yard one more time whether anybody at all wanted to make an offer on the deaf horse, Hannah Calloway said, $4, and her voice did not go up at the end of it. The laughing started at the chute end and came down the rail toward her like water finding a crack. The horse in the ring did not hear any of it. He was a dark bay gelding, better than 16 hands, heavy through the shoulder and deep in the girth, with black points and a white star and one white sock that had gone the color of weak tea from standing in the sail yard. His coat was rough and dust-dulled, grown out long for a September horse, and it had not been brushed in a good while. He stood in the middle of that ring with his head low and his ears loose, patient as a fence post, while 40 men made noise on all four sides of him, and he did not so much as roll an eye. That was what they were laughing at. Not the price. The price was only the joke's last word. $4, Marsh Kettleman repeated. He took his hat off and rubbed his forehead with the back of his wrist and put the hat back on. Ma'am, you understand there's no warranty on this animal. No warranty of any kind. He's deaf as a stove lid. I heard you say so the first 3 times. There's men here would tell you a horse that can't hear will kill you. There's men here would tell me anything, Hannah said. If you have ever been the only one in a room who was not laughing, stay with me, because this story turns, and the way it turns is worth your time. Subscribe if you want to ride the rest of it out with me. She had come to Hackberry Wells for a horse because she had to have one, and she had come with $11 because that was what there was. She had walked past the good geldings first, the way a person does when they are pricing their own poverty, and she had watched a rangy sorrel with a clean flat leg go for $60, and a plain little grulla go for $34. And she had known before noon that she was not going to buy a horse in the ordinary way. Then they ran the deaf one through, and nobody bid. And nobody bid again. And Marsh Kettleman started begging. Gus Prine was standing at the chute end with his thumbs in his vest. He owned the hatchet, which was 44 sections of the best grass in Cadence County and about 4,000 head of cattle. And he was the president of the Cadence Stock Association and the elected boss of the district roundup. And when he spoke, the laughing thinned out to hear him. Mrs. Calloway, Misser, Prine, I'll give you 6 for him. That got its own laugh. A warmer one, because it was generous, and everybody could see it was generous, and generosity from a rich man is the cheapest thing on earth. Hannah looked at him across the ring. Prine was 50-odd, big through the chest, gray coming in at the temples in the way that makes a man look like a bank. That's kind, she said. Bid it then, Prine smiled. I don't want the horse. I'm offering you $6 to not want him either. Sold at $4, said Marsh Kettleman, fast before it could get any worse, and slapped the rail. She paid in silver out of a knotted handkerchief and signed her name in the sale book in a small upright hand, and then she went into the ring to fetch her horse. And that was where the day taught her the first thing. She clucked to him. Nothing, she said. Hup, the way you say it to a horse who is standing where you want to walk. And he did not move, and she said it louder, and 40 men watched her say it louder, and the horse stood with his head low, and his weight cocked on one hind foot, and did not know she was alive. Then she came around into the space in front of his eyes, and he lifted his head, and he looked at her, and something in the yard went quiet that had nothing to do with the men. He looked at her the way a man looks at a door he has been waiting a long time to see open. All right, Hannah said, mostly to herself. All right. You have to see me. She put her hand flat on his nose, and he did not flinch. She walked to his shoulder, and he turned his head to keep her in his eye. She snapped the lead on the rope halter and stepped off, and he came off the mark with her, easy, matching her, close enough that his breath moved the loose hair at her temple. He led like a horse that had led 1,000 miles. He had never been hard to handle in his life. He had only ever been impossible to call. Somebody at the rail said, "Hey, horse," and whistled the two-note whistle every man in that country used, and the horse walked on past him, with his ears loose and his eye on Hannah, and the man laughed and said, "Well, hell," and the laugh went down the rail again in the other direction. She led him out through the gate and tied him to the rail of the mercantile, in the sun, and stood a moment with her hand on his neck. "What do they call you?" she said, and then she laughed at herself once, without any pleasure in it, because he could not answer, and he could not have answered anyway. The Cadence Stock Association met at 2 o'clock that afternoon in the back room of Deal's Bank, and Hannah Calloway had come 22 miles to be at it. There were 19 outfits in the district. The association did one thing that mattered above every other thing it did, and that was set the general roundup, the pooled wagon, the pooled riders, the order of the range, who worked which drainage in which week, and whose brand got read out and cut out at the tally. On open range in 1884, there was no other way to gather. Cattle from 19 outfits ran together across 60 miles of short grass and broken country, and once a year in the spring and once in the fall, every outfit threw its men and its horses into one wagon and worked the whole country together, and each man got back what was his. If you rode with the wagon, you got your increase, your strays, your beef cut, and your count. If you did not ride with the wagon, you did not get them. Not because a law said so, because 19 men in a back room said so, and there was nobody above them to say different. Hannah sat on a straight chair against the wall with her hat on her knee. She was the only woman in the room, and she had been the only woman in the room for 2 years, since Abel died, and she had learned to sit in it without moving much. Gus Prine did not do anything sly. That was the thing she thought about later, at night, in the months after, when she was trying to be honest with herself about what had happened to her. He did not lie. He did not forge a thing or bribe a man or whisper in a corner. He stood up in front of 19 outfits with his hat in his hand, and he said what everybody in that room already believed, and he said it kindly, and that was enough. "The wagon will work the ladder rim drainage the last week of September," Prine said. "It'll take 31 riders and near on 200 saddle horses to do it. Every outfit throws in men and mounts by the size of its brand. That's how it's always been done, and it's fair as far as it goes." He turned his hat around by the brim. "The crossbell can't throw in. Mrs. Calloway has one hand, and he's 64 years old, and she's got 9 head of saddle stock and 4 of them are green. She can't furnish her share. It isn't a slight on her. It's arithmetic." "I can furnish," Hannah said. "With what?" "With myself." "You are not 3 riders and 20 horses, ma'am," Prine said, and he said it gently, and half the room looked at the floor because it was true, and because it was gentle, and both of those things made it worse. "If the wagon works your country and you can't hold up your end, the cost of gathering the crossbell falls on 18 other outfits. I won't ask 18 outfits to carry one. You've carried the Stroud place 2 years running. Willis Stroud furnishes 2 hands and 14 horses. You carried the hatchet through the winter of '81 when you lost your whole remuda in the 6-mile blow, and this room voted you the wagon anyhow." Something moved across Prine's face, quick, and was put away. "That was different," he said. "How?" "Because it was me," he said. And he did not even know he had said it, and Hannah watched 19 men fail to notice that he had said it, and she understood in that minute that she was not going to win the vote. She did not win the vote. It went 14-5 with the Stroud brand, and 3 of the small outfits standing with her, and Ephraim Deal wrote in the association book that the general roundup for the fall of 1884 would not work the Crossbell range, and would not cut the Crossbell brand, and the meeting moved on to the question of a well at the Ladder Rim Water, and whether the district would stand the cost of a new bull. Hannah sat through the rest of it. She had decided on the way in that she would sit through the rest of it, whichever way it went, because leaving early was a thing they would talk about for a year. Afterward, on the walk in the street, Prine caught up with her. He was not gloating. He had the decency, or the calculation, not to gloat. "I'll make you an offer," he said. "The bell draw and everything on it. $900, and I'll take the note off Deal's hands, and you can be out from under all of it by the middle of October and go to your people in Nebraska with money in your pocket. I don't have people in Nebraska. Then go somewhere and have some." Hannah stopped in the street. The deaf horse was tied at the mercantile rail 40 feet away, with his head low in the sun, and she was looking at him and not at Prine when she answered. "The bell draw runs water in August," she said. "There's 4 sections of shelter in it that don't blow. You've wanted it since before Abel was cold. You don't need it. You want it the way a man wants the last biscuit. I'm offering you a way out of a hole. You dug the hole this afternoon." "I did not," Prine said, and now there was heat in him. "I told the truth in a room. You want to be angry at somebody? Be angry at the arithmetic." "I intend to," Hannah said. "I intend to be very angry at the arithmetic." She walked to the rail and untied her $4 horse. Prine watched her do it. "You cannot gather 240 head of open-range cattle off the Ladder Rim country alone in 29 days, Mrs. Calloway, not with 40 men. It has never been done. It's never been necessary. And that," he said, "is a deaf horse." Hannah came around to the front of the gelding where he could see her, and put her hand flat on his nose the way she had learned to do it 3 hours before, and he lifted his head and looked at her, and she turned and led him off up the street. Behind her, up on the hill, the church bell at Hackberry Wells rang the half-hour 3 cracked strokes that every soul in that town turned their head for. The horse did not turn his head. He walked out of town at her shoulder in the dust and the light with his ears loose and his eye on her. And he was the only living thing on that street who had not heard a single word anybody said about him all day long. The Crossbell lay 22 miles north and west of Hackberry Wells, up 6 Mill Creek, in a long, sheltered fold of country the maps called nothing, and everybody called the Bell Draw. It was 4 sections of the best wintering ground on that side of the divide, and the reason it was the best was not the grass, though the grass was good. It was that the draw ran roughly northeast, and the cutbanks on the west side stood 30 feet high in places, so that when the wind came off the rim in January carrying half of Montana in front of it, the bottom of the bell draw stayed still. Cattle could stand in it. Water ran in it in August, out of a seep under the rimrock, when the 6 Mile itself was nothing but hot rock and grasshoppers for 11 miles in either direction. Abel Calloway had found it in 1878 with $70 and a spring wagon, and he had put up the house himself out of cottonwood logs hauled 9 miles. And he had made the brand out of 2 pieces of wagon iron on a stump anvil, a cross, and under it a bell. He had liked the shape of it. He had said a bell was a thing that told the truth about where you were, and Hannah had told him that was a sentimental way to think about a running iron, and he had agreed cheerfully and gone on making it anyway. He had been dead 26 months. A wagon had gone over with him in the cut below the rim in a July storm, and it had taken him 3 days, and the thing Hannah remembered was not the 3 days. It was that on the second night he had held her wrist and asked her whether she could hear the bell on the lead mare out in the dark, and there had been no bell and no mare, and she had said yes. She rode into the yard a little after 8 o'clock at night, with the deaf horse walking loose behind her on a lead she had not once had to pull, and Tobe Riddle came out of the barn with a lantern and looked at what she had brought home. Tobe was 64. He had ridden for Abel from the first year, and for Hannah since, and he had a hip that had been broken in 1871 and reset by a man who was drunk. So he walked like a chair being moved. He held the lantern up and looked the gelding over from the ground up, the way a man does, who has been looking at horses since he was 9 years old, and Hannah watched him do it, and found that she was holding her breath. "Well," Tobe said, "say it. That's a lot of horse." "He's deaf. I know what he is. Whole county knows what he is." Tobe walked around him, slow, and ran a hand down the near hind and picked the foot up and set it down. "Legs are clean as a whistle. Feet are good. He's got more bone under him than anything in this barn." He straightened up. "What'd you give?" $4. Tobe was quiet a moment. Then he said, "Somebody's a fool, and I ain't decided yet who." And he took the lead out of her hand and walked the horse into the barn and stopped and turned around because the horse had not followed him. It had stayed standing in the yard looking at Hannah, and the lead had come up tight and slid out of Tobe's fingers. "He can't hear you go," Hannah said. "He has to see it." She came around into the front of him and put her hand flat on his nose and then walked, and he came. And Tobe stood in the barn door with the lantern and watched a $4 horse walk past him into the light, with his eye locked on a woman like she was the only fixed thing in the world. "Huh," Tobe said. They named him 3 days later, and Hannah named him for the day. She had been trying names on him all week the way you do, out loud, which was the joke of it, and none of them had fit. And on Sunday morning she was standing in the corral with a curry comb working the winter out of his shoulder when the wind came right and carried the church bell up from Hackberry Wells, 22 miles off, thin as a wire. The way it did maybe 6 mornings a year when the air lay a certain way over the rim. She stopped currying and listened to it. It came twice more and quit. The horse had not lifted his head. He had his weight cocked and his eye half shut, and her hand on his shoulder, and the whole visible world for him was a woman with a comb and the smell of dust coming off his own coat. And there was no bell in it, and there never would be. "Sunday," Hannah said. She learned him that first month the way you learn a language, which is to say badly, and then all at once. Everything she had ever known about handling a horse ran through sound, and she had never once noticed it. She had not known how much she talked. She had not known that half of what she did with a horse was done from behind it, or beside it, or with her back turned, and that the horse followed along on the strength of her voice, going on ahead of her like a rope. Take the voice away, and there was nothing. Take the voice away, and she was a shape in the dark that appeared without warning. So the first thing she learned was that she could never come up behind him, and that this was not skittishness. He had been hit in the world by things he could not see coming for his whole life, and he had made one rule about it, which was that anything arriving from behind got the benefit of the doubt exactly once. Tobe found that out with a shoulder against a stall post and a week of not lifting his arm above his head, and he never blamed the horse for it, which Hannah thought was the best thing she knew about Tobe Riddle. After that she made a rule of her own, and she never once broke it in all the years. She came into his eye first, always, every time, even when it cost her 20 steps. The second thing she learned was that he watched. Every horse looks. Sunday watched. He watched the way a man on a roof watches weather. She would be in the tack room and would come out and find his head over the corral rail pointed at the north gate, and 40 seconds later a rider would come up out of the 6-mile cut where no rider could be seen. She would be at the well, and he would go rigid and stare at nothing at all in the long grass, and Tobe would say it was a fool horse, staring at fool nothing. And then a badger would come out of the nothing and go down the draw. "It ain't his eyes," Tobe said one evening. "His eyes ain't no better than mine." "What is it then, feet?" Tobe spat. ground telegraphs. Everything with a foot on the dirt knows it some. He's just the only one paying attention, on account of he ain't got nothing else to pay it with. The third thing she learned was how to talk to him, and that took the longest. And it was the thing that changed everything afterward. She built it out of nothing, a piece at a time, standing in a corral in the last light after 14 hours of work, because there was no other hour to do it in. A flat palm held up meant stand. A flat palm turned over and lowered meant drop your head. 2 fingers touched to her own shoulder and then swept low and out meant go on, get out there, get around them. A fist meant hold. A hand laid on his neck and held still, without any pressure at all, meant everything is all right. I am here. This is nothing. He learned them the way a horse learns anything, which is imperfectly, and then all at once, and then forever. But he learned them faster than any horse she had ever had her hands on, and it took her a while to understand why. And when she did understand it, she sat down on the corral rail and had to hold on to it. He learned them fast because he had spent his entire life watching people for the one thing that would tell him what was about to happen. Every other horse in Cadence County got told. Sunday had only ever been able to guess. He had been studying human beings, hard, with everything in him, since the day he was foaled, and nobody had ever once studied him back. Which of us was the dumb one? Hannah said out loud, in the dark, to a horse who could not hear her. She rode him the first time on the 4th day, and half the reason she did it that soon was that she was afraid that if she waited she would start to believe the county. Tobe stood at the gate and did not say anything, which was his way of saying a great deal. She had him saddled in a plain old rig of Abel's, with a blanket doubled under it, and she came around into his eye and let him see the whole thing, the reins, her boot, all of it, and she got up slow. Nothing happened. She sat there. He stood there. He turned his head a little to bring her into his eye, and then let it go, and stood there some more, and the whole thing had all the drama of a man sitting down at a table. He's rode before, Tobe said. He's rode a lot. Somebody rode him. Somebody rode him hard and long and knew what they was about. Tobe worked his jaw. That ain't a green horse, Hannah. That's a made horse. You don't get a rein like that by accident. She took him out of the corral and up the draw at a walk, and then a trot, and then let him out, and the $4 came apart underneath her like a piece of bad arithmetic. He had a stride that ate the ground and did not seem to be trying. He took a cut bank down and up without gathering himself. He went into a badger hole to the fetlock at a lope and came out of it clean and never checked. When she put a hand flat on his neck and held it, he came down to a walk on nothing but that, and she felt her own eyes sting, which made her angry, so she went on riding. It was on the way back that she found out the last thing, and she found it out by accident, and it was the one that mattered. Tobe had gone up on the rim after a coyote that had been working the calving pen, and he had not seen her come around the point, and he shot at 60 yards. Hannah was 30 feet from the muzzle when it went off. She came half out of the saddle. The old bay pony, 100 yards back on a lead, went straight up in the air and then straight backward and broke the lead and ran 400 yards before it stopped and stood shaking. Sunday walked on. He did not flinch. He did not check. His ears did not so much as swivel, because there was nothing for them to swivel toward, and he had not the least idea that anything had occurred in the world at all. And he simply kept walking up the draw at the same easy 4-mile walk, carrying a woman who had gone entirely still on his back. Hannah pulled him up. She sat there in the middle of the bell draw with her heart going and the smell of powder coming down on the wind and the pony still running, and she looked down at the top of that rough dust-dulled bay neck, and she thought, very clearly and very quietly, the way you think a thing you are going to build the rest of your life on, there is not another horse in this territory that would have done that. Tobe came down off the rim, leading nothing and looking sick. God almighty, Hannah, I never saw you. I know. Are you all right? Tobe, she said, and her voice was strange to her. Do you know what he is? The old man looked at the horse. The horse looked back at him mildly, waiting to be told something with a hand. He's a deaf horse, Tobe said. He is a horse that cannot be scared by a sound, Hannah said. There isn't any such thing. And I've got one. Word of the $4 horse got to Hackberry Wells before she did, and by the time she came in on the 19th for salt and a keg of nails, it had grown a name. They called him the widow's dummy horse. She heard it first from a hand outside the livery, who did not know she was behind him. And she heard it a second time inside the mercantile, from a man who did know, and said it anyway, and the second one was easier, because at least it was honest. Gus Prine was at the dry goods counter with 9 yards of poplin and a list. She was a handsome woman of about 45 who wore her clothes the way a courthouse wears its clock, and she had been kind to Hannah exactly twice, both times in the first month after Abel died, and had considered the debt discharged. Mrs. Calloway Idalia looked up and did not smile and did not need to. I hear you've been buying horses. One horse. Gus says he offered you $6 to leave it in the ring. He did. You should have taken it, Idalia said, in a voice that carried very comfortably to the stove, where 4 men were pretending to look at a catalog. There is a kind of woman who believes that being stubborn is the same thing as being right. I have watched several of them lose everything they had, and I have never once seen one of them change her mind in time. Hannah set the salt on the counter and counted out the money and did not look up. You'll want to hear the rest of it, Idalia said, and laid it out the way a woman lays down a hand she has been holding all week. The association would work the ladder rim the last week of the month. 31 riders, starting at the 6-mile crossing and working north. Everything on that country would be thrown together and pushed to the rim water. And every brand in the district would be cut out of it and held. Except one, Idalia said. I know what the vote was. I was in the room. Then you know your cattle will be in that gather whether you are or not. 31 men would push the crossbell stuff for her. They would cut the hatchet out of it, and the broken arrow, and the stroud, and the lazy jay. And they would leave the crossbell standing in the middle of the herd, because the crossbell had not been voted a place at the tally. Her cattle would be a mile from her own gate, with 31 riders around them, and not one of those riders permitted to lay a rope on a single head for her. Then the wagon would move on, and whatever was left would drift with the first weather. And by the middle of October her increase would be 40 miles north in another district with somebody else's iron on it. Not stolen, Idalia said, just gone. That is what the vote was. The stove was very quiet. Hannah picked up the salt. How many head has the hatchet got? She asked. Idalia blinked. 4,000, near enough. And how many has the crossbell? I'm sure I don't know. 350, Hannah said. 240 steers and 110 cows, on 4 sections, and a piece of open range, and that is the whole of what stands between me and nothing at all. Gus Prine had 4,000 head and 44 sections, and the presidency of the association, and the vote of 19 outfits, and he had spent the week arranging matters so that a widow could not gather 240 steers. Hannah put the salt under her arm. Say that back to yourself tonight, she said. In your own room, in your own voice. See if it sounds to you the way it sounds to me. She went out. Behind her, one of the men at the stove laughed once, and then thought better of it. The man was named Vernon Tack, and he rode for the hatchet, and Hannah would have cause to remember him. She met Caleb Doyle at the water gap on the 20th. The Crossbells East line ran down to the 6 Mile, at a place where the creek came through a break in the ledge, and Abel had built a water gap there out of poles and wire, so that the creek could rise without taking the fence, and the cattle could not walk the creek bed out of the country. It needed rebuilding twice a year, and it had needed rebuilding since June. She was in the water to her knees, in the blue dress with the hem hauled up and knotted, wiring a pole to a deadman, with Sunday standing loose on the bank above her, because there was nothing to tie him to, and no reason to. She had left the flat palm up. He stood. A rider came down the far side of the creek at a walk, and stopped 40 yards off and sat there. He was maybe 35, narrow, sunburned across the nose, with a hat that had been shaped and reshaped so many times it had a personality. He rode a good clean-legged sorrel. He wore the Hatchett's brand on his saddle skirt. Hannah went on wiring. After a while the man said, "That gap wants a rock crib on the upstream side. It wants about $9 worth of wire. Rock's free. So is advice." He took that without any change of face at all. He looked past her, at the horse standing loose on the bank with no rope on him, and nothing holding him but a palm shown 20 minutes ago. "How long will he stand like that?" "I don't know yet," Hannah said. "Longest so far is an hour and a half." The man was quiet a while. "I broke horses in the Bitterroot for a man named Otis Frame," he said finally. Frame had a bitch dog, blue heeler, deaf as a post. Everybody said drown her. He shifted his weight in the saddle. That dog worked cattle 11 years. She'd take a hand signal at 300 yards in the dark of the moon. Frame used to say she was the only creature on the place that never once did a thing, because somebody hollered at her. Hannah stood up out of the creek with her hands full of wire. "Say that name again?" "Otis Frame." "Where is he?" "Right here in this county, last I knew. Drills wells." The man lifted his chin at the horse. "Ma'am, I ain't going to tell you what to do with your business, but you'd want to talk to him." "Why?" "Because I have seen that horse before," Caleb Doyle said, "and I did not see him at a sale." He turned the sorrel and went back up the far bank, and at the top he stopped. "They're starting the wagon on the 27th at the 6 Mile crossing," he said, "working north to the Rimwater, then east. Whatever's on that country when they come through is going to get pushed. That's all I come to say, and I'd take it kindly if you didn't say where you got it." "Why are you telling me?" Caleb Doyle looked down at the creek for a moment, and then at her, and he had a plain, flat way of looking at a person that was neither soft nor hard. "Because I watched a woman stand in a room and get outvoted by arithmetic," he said, "and I have been thinking about it for 5 days, and I find I don't care for it." Then he rode off, and Hannah Calloway stood in the water with the wire in her hands for longer than the work needed. She started the gather on the 21st of September, alone, with 24 days on the clock. There is no honest way to make that sound smaller than it was. A general roundup put 31 riders and 200 horses on the country, and it took them 11 days to work the ladder rim drainage. And at the end of it, every outfit got its cattle. Hannah Calloway proposed to work the same country with one woman, one 64-year-old man with a bad hip, 9 head of saddle stock, of which 4 were green, and a horse that could not be called. She did not try to do what the wagon did. That was the first good decision, and she made it sitting at the kitchen table on the night of the 20th with a stub of pencil and the back of a feed bill, and it was the decision that made all the rest of it possible. The wagon gathered everything and sorted afterward. 31 riders could afford to. She could not sort. Sorting is what takes the men. So she was not going to gather cattle at all. She was going to gather her own cattle, and only her own, one bunch at a time, from the outside edges in, and she was going to do it in the 4 days before the wagon came through, and turn what the wagon did to her advantage instead of standing in front of it. Because a general roundup is a wave. It pushes everything on the country in one direction. And Prine had announced the direction in a back room in front of 19 witnesses. They would start at the 6-mile crossing and work north to the rim water. Everything between would move north ahead of 31 riders. Her cattle would be in that wave, and she could not stop it, and she could not join it. But she could stand where it came out. "Here," she said, and put the pencil point down on the feed bill so hard it went through the paper. "The latter rim water sits in a bowl. There's 3 ways out of that bowl. 2 of them are wide, and one of them is the head of the bell draw, and it is 90 feet across at the neck, and it is mine, and it is the way home." Tobe leaned over the paper. "You're going to let 31 men gather your cattle for you," he said slowly. "I'm going to let 31 men gather my cattle for me. And then hold the neck of the draw and take back what's yours as it comes by. Every head I can put a rope or a horse in front of." Tobe sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a while. "It's about the only thing that could work," he said. "Now hear the cost from somebody that likes you. 4 days on that neck, day and night, with 2 people. It would be blowing cold by then. Every man in the gather would be watching her do it, and Gus Prine would be sitting up on that hill knowing exactly what she was at, and there was nothing on this earth to stop him from working the country the other way around and pushing the whole of it south instead, purely to break her." "There is one thing," Hannah said. "What, 19 outfits watching him do it?" she said. "He's a proud man, Tobe. That's not the same as a mean one, and it is the only thing I have got to work with, so I intend to work it until it comes apart in my hands." She rode out at 4 o'clock the next morning on a deaf horse, in the dark, with a bedroll and 11 days of food and a rope she had spliced herself, and she did not come back to the house for 6 days. The 6 days that followed were the hardest riding of her life to that point, and she would say afterward that they were also, in a way she never entirely managed to explain to anybody, the happiest she had been since 1882. She worked the outside first, the far edges, the country the wave would not reach. The breaks under the east rimrock, where the brush was head-high and full of cattle that had not seen a rider since spring, and the long, dry benches south of the 6-mile, where the cross-bell stuff drifted in dry years and stayed. She went in on foot in places where a horse could not go and pushed the brush stuff out with a slicker and her own 2 hands, and she brought them out in bunches of 9 and 14, and once, on the 4th day, a bunch of 31 that had watered in a seep nobody had counted on since Abel found it. She learned in those 6 days what she had bought for $4. A cutting horse works off what he sees, and Sunday saw everything. She had thought the deafness would cost her in the brush, where a horse hears a cow break before he sees her. It cost her nothing. He felt them. He would come around a point of brush with his head up and his whole body pointed at a spot in the tangle 50 feet off, and there would be a cow standing in it. And Hannah stopped questioning it about the 3rd time and started simply going where he pointed. And he did not spook. That was the thing that added up, hour by hour, until it became the whole difference. Every horse she had ever gathered on had spent a certain part of every day being surprised, a grouse going up under his feet, a cow breaking behind him, a rock rolling, a slicker cracking. Every one of those cost a beat, a bobble, a half-second of a horse thinking about himself instead of about the work. Over 14 hours it came to a great deal. Sunday never once thought about himself. There was nothing to think about. The world came at him through his eyes and his feet, and it never came in through his ears at all, and so he simply went on doing the thing in front of him, all day, with a kind of unhurried attention that she had never felt in an animal. On the 2nd night, she counted 41 head in the holding trap under the house. On the 4th, 78. On the 6th, she came down the draw at dusk with 19 more in front of her, filthy to the shoulder, with a tear in the blue dress from hip to knee that she had sewn up twice with a saddle needle, and Tobe swung the gate and counted them in and said, 97, and then said, "Hannah, you got to eat something," And she said, "In a minute," and sat down on the step and did not get up for an hour. She rode Sunday 5 of those 6 days. The other day she rested him and rode the green 4-year-old and lost most of an afternoon to it, and after that she did the arithmetic differently. She had 9 head of saddle stock. In a general roundup, a man rode 6 or 7 horses through a day's work in strings, and Prine had said 200 horses for 31 riders, and he had not been exaggerating. A cow horse gathering hard country is used up in half a day. Sunday was not being used up. She watched for it, because she was afraid of it, and it did not come. He came in at dark tired, and he ate, and he lay down flat on his side in the corral like a dog, and at 4 in the morning when she came out with the lantern, he would already be standing at the gate looking for her, and he would go again. "That horse ain't right," Tobe said, and meant it as high praise. "He's just not wasting any of it," Hannah said. The wagon came on the 27th, and it came the way weather comes. She heard it before she saw it, from the neck of the bell draw, which was the last small joke of that whole autumn. The sound came up out of the bowl at the ladder rimwater at about 10 in the morning. And it was a sound she had known all her life, and never once heard from outside of it. 31 riders. 1,100 head of gathered cattle bawling and moving. The rattle of the wagon, the cook's dogs, men whistling and hollering across a mile of open country. Somebody's lead mare had a bell on, and it came up through all of it, high and flat and steady, ringing every time the mare took a step. Hannah sat the deaf horse on the neck of the draw and listened to a bell she had heard 10,000 times. Sunday stood under her, with his head up and his eye on the far side of the bowl, watching dust, and to him the whole enormous noise of it did not exist, and the only thing in the world was that something large was moving over there, and a woman on his back had not yet told him what to do about it. She put her hand flat on his neck and held it. "Nothing," she said. "This is nothing. Wait." They came out of the bowl at 2 in the afternoon, and they came out the wide way first, and for 1 bad hour she thought they were going to hold everything at the water and cut in the bowl, which would have finished her. Then the wave broke, and the first bunch came up the country toward the neck of the bell draw, 200 head at a walk, with 3 riders behind. And Hannah Calloway rode down off the point into her own gate and started taking back what was hers. It was not a fight. That surprised her afterward. She had ridden down there with her jaw set for a fight, and there was no fight in it at all, because the men pushing that first bunch were 3 young hands from the Broken Arrow and the Lazy J who had voted for nothing and been told nothing. And when a woman in a torn blue dress on a big dark bay came into the front of 200 moving cattle and started cutting the crossbell stuff out of the lead, they did what cowhands do, which is hold what they have got and watch a person work. She cut 22 head out of that bunch in 40 minutes. She did it on a horse that could not hear a cow move, in the middle of 200 cattle and 3 riders and a wind that had come up out of the north, and afterward one of the Lazy J boys, who was 20 years old and named Fenno, rode over to Tobe at the gate and said, in the tone of a man reporting a religious experience, "Mister, that horse turned inside himself." Prine came at 4. He came alone, up the long slope from the water with the wagon behind him. And he sat his horse 30 feet off and watched her cut a red cow and a heifer out of the tail of a bunch and put them through her gate, and he waited until she was done, which she gave him credit for. "This is a hard way to do it," he said. "It's the way that's left. You know I could work the country south. You could. I could push every hoof on the ladder rim down the 6 mile and out of this district in 2 days, and there is not a thing in the association book that says I can't." "That's true," Hannah said. She was breathing hard. Her hands were bleeding at the base of both thumbs where the rope had been through them, and 31 men would watch you do it. Every one of them would know exactly what he was watching, He would stop being Gus Prine, who was right about the arithmetic, and start being Gus Prine, who broke the widow, and he had been wearing the first one for a week and liked the way it fit. "You'd have to take it off," she said. Prine's jaw worked. "You have a low opinion of me. I have an accurate opinion of you," she said. "The low one would be a lot easier on us both." He looked at the horse for a long moment. Sunday was standing in the gate with his flanks going and his head down and the reins loose on his neck, dark with sweat all down the shoulder, and he was looking at Prine with a mild, level, unhurried attention. "He don't hear a thing, does he?" Prine said. "Not one thing, not one." "Then how in God's name does he know where you want him?" "He watches me," Hannah said. "Nobody in 22 years thought to find out what he could do if somebody watched him back." Prine turned his horse and rode down to the wagon, and he worked the country north, the way he had said he would in the back room, and he did not push a single head of her cattle out of the district. She was never sure, afterward, whether that was decency or pride, and she came to think it did not matter much which, because in men of that kind they are usually the same organ. 4 days she held that neck. They were the 4 longest days of the whole thing. The wave came out of the bowl in bunches from daylight until it was too dark to see, and she and Tobe took the neck in turns and did not both sleep at once. And on the second night it came on to blow cold and rain a little, and she sat the whole night in a slicker with her hat tied down. Caleb Doyle came twice, at night, both times after 11 o'clock. And both times he came up the draw slow and let himself be seen a long way off. The first night he brought 14 head of crossbell steers he had cut out of the Hatchett's day herd himself, and pushed 6 miles in the dark, and he put them through her gate and did not get off his horse. "You'll get run off for that," Hannah said. "Likely I can't pay you." "I never said anything about pay," Caleb said, "and I'd take it as a kindness if you didn't bring it up again." The second night he brought 9 head and a tin of coffee and news. "Prine's holding the beef cut at the Rimwater till the 9th, he said. Then he'll trail 1,100 head to Hackberry Wells for the last cars on the 14th. He'll water at the 6 Mile crossing on the 12th because there ain't any other water between the Rim and town." He drank his coffee looking out at the dark. "Everybody in this district that's shipping this year is going to be on that same trail in the same 3 days. It'll be the biggest bunch of cattle stood on that flat since '79. Including me, including you if you get there." He looked at her sideways. "How many have you got?" 168. Caleb Doyle was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Since the 21st? "Since the 21st. "Ma'am," he said, "there's 31 men down at that wagon, and I'd be obliged if you'd let me be the one that tells them." On the night of the 30th the sky put on a show over the latter rim and told her what she had. It was a dry storm, the kind that comes up the divide in the last of September and goes over without wetting a hat. No rain to speak of, only wind and a black wall to the west, and sheet lightning walking along the top of the rim, and thunder that did not crack so much as fall over, a long tumbling boom that went on rolling around the bowl for 20 seconds after each stroke. Hannah was on the neck of the draw with 200 head of gathered cattle behind her in the trap, and the trap fence was 3 wires and a prayer. The cattle went up like a struck match. She had been around stock her whole life, and she had never felt anything to equal it. 200 animals that had been lying down chewing came off the ground all at once as one animal, and the trap fence went. And the whole bunch swung down the draw in the dark with the thunder still rolling. And every horse in that country lost its mind at the same instant. Tobe's mount went over backward in the yard 400 yards below and put him in the water trough. The 4 green ones broke the corral. The old bay pony ran into the wire and stood there shaking with its head over the top strand. Sunday was standing under the point of rock at the top of the neck, tied to nothing, where she had left him with a flat palm 25 minutes before, and when the sky came apart over the rim, he lifted his head and looked at the light, mildly, the way a man looks up from a newspaper. That was all. He looked at the light. Then he lowered his head again and went back to the grass. And 200 cattle ran past him at 30 feet, and he watched them go by with a stem of bluestem hanging out the side of his mouth. Hannah got to him at a dead run with her hat gone. She came around into his eye. She never once forgot it, not even then, and she was in the saddle before she had finished arriving, and they went off that point into the dark after 200 running cattle. It took her until 3 a.m. to get them stopped and held, and she did it alone, in the black dark, on a horse that did not know there was any thunder. She sat him at the end of it in the bottom of the draw, with the cattle finally milling and blowing, and the last of the storm muttering away east, and she was shaking so hard she had to hold the horn with both hands, and she said out loud, "To nobody, you are not a cheap horse. You are the most valuable animal in this territory, and nobody knows it but me." She found Otis Frame on the 1st of October, 14 miles down the 6 Mile, at a well he was drilling for the Broken Arrow. He was 70 if he was a day, a small dried-out man with a white beard stained yellow at the corner of his mouth and hands like a bundle of dry sticks. And he had a rig set up over a hole, and a mule on a sweep, and a boy of about 19 doing the walking, and he sat on a nail keg while he worked, because his legs had given out on him in 1879. Hannah rode up and stopped 30 feet off, and did not say anything at all, because Otis Frame had come off the keg the moment she came into the clearing, and he was standing up, and he was not looking at her. He was looking at the horse. He looked at that horse for the better part of a minute without saying one word, and then he took his hat off, which is not a thing that old men in that country did often, and he said, in a voice that had gone thin, "Where'd you get him?" "Sale ring at Hackberry Wells." $4. $4, said Otis Frame. He came over on his bad legs, one hand out, and Hannah started to say, "Be careful, come around," into his eye, and did not get the words out, because Frame walked straight around into the front of the horse without breaking stride, into his eye, the way a person does who has never in his life done it any other way. And he put his hand flat on the big bay's nose. And the horse dropped his head into it and breathed on him, and Otis Frame stood there in the sun with his hat in one hand and his other hand on a horse's face, and he cried the way old men cry, which is silently and with terrible economy. "His name is Powder," he said. "His name is Sunday now." "That's a better name," Frame said. "That is a considerably better name. Get down, ma'am, and I'll tell you what you bought." She got down. He sat back on the keg. He talked for an hour and 10 minutes. Otis Frame had drilled wells and shot rock in that country since 1866. To shoot rock you use black powder, and to get black powder and tools and water and pipe out to a hole 30 miles from anywhere you use horses, and the trouble with that arrangement, which he explained to her with great patience as though it were the most interesting problem in the world, is that no horse on earth wants to stand next to a shot. "You can't tie 'em," he said, "can't hobble 'em, can't hold 'em. Tie a horse and shoot a hole within 200 yards, and he would fight that rope until he went down. Hobble him, and he went over. Hold him, and he took the man with him." Frame had had 6 horses hurt and 2 men hurt in 18 years, and every one of them had been the same thing, which was a horse that heard something. Sunday had been foaled in 1875 out of a good, plain, heavy-boned mare Frame had bought in Cheyenne, and he had come into the world hearing perfectly well. He was 3, best young horse I ever raised. Frame had had him on the rig at the Antelope Hole in 1878. They set a charge in a seam, and it went early. Not the horse's fault, and not Frame's either, though he had had 6 years to argue that out with himself. The gelding had been standing 20 feet off. The ground took it, and he went over. He wasn't hurt, not a mark on him. Got up, shook, walked off. Ate his supper. Frame worked his jaw. Only he never turned his head for a thing again. Not the dinner bell, not a whistle, not a wolf. Frame had stood behind him in the barn and hollered his name for 10 minutes with his hat in his hand, and the horse never twitched an ear, and an old man sat down on the floor of that barn and said out loud that he had ruined the best horse in Wyoming. Hannah said quietly, "But you didn't." "No, ma'am," said Otis Frame. "I did not. Because in about a month it come to me what I had. He had a horse that could stand at a shot. He worked that horse for 4 more years, and he never lost another animal and never had another man hurt, because Powder would stand at the rig, loose, in the open, 40 feet from the collar of the hole, while a charge went off in the rock, and the shock would come up through his feet, and he would shift his weight and go back to his hay. Frame taught him hand signs because he had to. Frame rode him 30 miles in a day and worked him on cattle in the fall for wages and put him in a wagon in the winter, and Powder did all of it and became, over 4 years, exactly the thing Hannah had felt underneath her, a made horse, a finished horse, a horse with 4,000 hours on him. Then in '82 my legs went, Frame said, and I couldn't keep but the mule. He had sold the horse to a man out of Ogallala for $140. That man kept him 8 months and sold him on for $60 because he could not call him in from pasture. That man sold him to the hatchet for $25. Hannah's head came up. The hatchet. Prine's outfit kept him 5 weeks, Frame said. A hand had walked up behind him in a stall and got knocked down for it, and after that they had him written in the book as a killer, and they ran him through the sale twice, and nobody would have him, and Frame expected they would have run him a 3rd time. He spat. $25. Down to 4. There's the whole education of the human race in them 2 numbers, and I ain't never got over it. Hannah sat on the ground with her arms around her knees and looked at the horse, who was standing loose in the clearing with his head low and one hind foot cocked, doing what he did, which was wait to be shown something. "They didn't ruin him," she said slowly. "That's what I've had wrong for 2 weeks. I've been thinking about what was taken off of him. What have you got now?" "They took his ears off him," Hannah said, "and he went and built something else." Otis Frame nodded once, slowly, like a man agreeing with a thing he had known for 6 years and never had the words for. "I'll tell you what you've got," he said. "Every horse in this world, when the world comes apart, runs. It was the whole of what a horse was. It was why men had them, and why no man ever quite had them." Frame pointed a dry finger at the big bay. "That one don't know the world's come apart. Nothing will move him. Nothing that comes through the air. Anyhow, he put his hat back on. You keep him away from Gus Prine. He's already seen him." "Then God help you," said Otis Frame, "because Gus Prine is a horseman, and sooner or later he is going to work out what he sold for $25. By the 4th of October she had 210 head in the trap under the house, and the whole district was talking about her. It had turned somewhere around the 29th, and she had not been there to see it turn, which she was sorry about for the rest of her life. What she got was the reports. Fenno, the 20-year-old off the Lazy J, had told the story of the cut at the neck of the draw to the wagon crew on the night of the 27th, and had told it badly and at great length and about 9 times, and by the 30th there were 31 men at a roundup wagon arguing about a deaf horse. Cowhands are the biggest gossips God ever made, and they are also, in the particular matter of a horse, incorruptible. A man will lie about a woman and a card game and a fight. He will not lie about what a horse did, because there were other men there. So the thing that came up out of the Ladder Rim country in the first week of October was not a rumor. It was testimony. The Broken Arrow's wagon boss had seen the bay stand loose on a point through the whole dry storm of the 30th, while every other horse in the drainage broke something. Two of the hatchet's own hands had watched Hannah cut 22 head out of a moving bunch in 40 minutes. Somebody had ridden up on her at 5 in the morning on the 2nd and found her asleep sitting up against a rock with the reins around her wrist and the horse standing over her, awake, watching the country. "They've quit calling him the dummy horse," Tobe reported, coming back from the rim water with a sack of flour and an expression Hannah had not seen on him in 2 years. "Fella at the wagon asked me was it true he'd stand at a shot." "What did you tell him?" "I told him he'd stand at the second coming," Tobe said, "and I'd take $3 off any man that cared to bet." Gus Prine came up the draw on the afternoon of the 5th, alone, and this time he got down off his horse. That was the thing that told her it was serious. In 2 years he had never once got off his horse in her yard. He stood at the corral rail and looked at the big bay for a while. Sunday came over to the rail the way he did, out of pure curiosity, and put his head over it, and Prine, who was a horseman and could not help himself, ran a hand down the front of the near foreleg, and felt the cannon bone and stood back up. 9 inches of bone, he said. 9 1/4. I had this horse. "I know you did," Hannah said. 5 weeks. You had him written in your book as a killer, and you ran him through the ring twice. "I never laid eyes on him," Prine said. "That's the truth, and it's no credit to me." The horse had come in with a string out of Ogallala, and a hand had got hurt, and his foreman had written the animal off. And Gus Prine had signed what his foreman put in front of him, because he had 4,000 head and 44 sections, and he signed 60 things a week. He turned around. "That's the whole reason I'm in your yard. I'll give you $200 for him." Hannah did not say anything for a moment. $200 was a very great deal of money. It was more than any saddle horse had ever brought in Cadence County. It was 5 months of a good hand's wages. It was 14% of the note, and it was 50 times what she had paid 20 days before. "No," she said. "250. "No, Mrs. Calloway." Prine took his hat off and turned it around by the brim, which she had learned was the thing he did before he said something he had rehearsed. "I'll be plain, because I think you've earned plain." She had 210 head and needed 240 to clear the note, and he knew it, because Ephraim Deal was a banker and bankers talk. She had 9 days. She had one hand, who was 64 with a bad hip, and she was going to have to trail those cattle 41 miles to Hackberry Wells across the 6-mile flat in the same 3 days that 6,000 head out of that district were trailing the same ground to the same cars. He put the hat back on. "You've done a thing nobody in this county thought could be done, and I've said so at my own wagon, and I'll say it in town. And you're still going to lose. You're 30 head short and out of horses and out of days, and $250 closes every bit of it. It closes it this year. This year is the one that's got you by the throat. And next year I'd have no horse." He was offering her $250 for the reason she was still standing up. It was not a rescue. It was the last piece of the same conversation they had been having since the 15th of September, which was a reasonable man explaining to her, reasonably, why she ought to hand over the thing that made her possible. Prine looked at her for a long moment. "You know what your trouble is," he said, and there was something almost like affection in it, and it made her angrier than anything else he had said. "You have decided that this is a story about right and wrong. It ain't. It's a story about a woman with 210 head and 9 days. Then I'd best go get 30 more, Hannah said. He rode off. At the mouth of the draw he pulled up and turned in the saddle and called back across 200 yards of grass, and the wind took most of it, but she got the part that mattered. 300. And Hannah Calloway, standing in the door of a cottonwood log house with her hands raw and her hem in rags, laughed for the first time in 3 weeks, out loud, alone, at the top of the bell draw. They came on the night of the 6th. She never got the whole of it in one piece. What she got was the arithmetic afterward, and Vernon Tack's own account 8 days later, and the thing she could see with her own eyes at first light, and those 3 things fit together well enough. Vernon Tack had ridden for the hatchet 11 years, and had never once been thanked for anything, and he had sat by the stove in the mercantile, and heard Abel Prine say what a certain kind of woman deserved, and he had sat at the wagon on the night of the 30th, and listened to 31 men who used to laugh at a widow talk about her the way they talked about a good horse. He had a small grievance, and no imagination, and a great deal of loyalty pointed in a direction nobody had asked him to point it in. That is the whole recipe, and it has never needed anything else. He did not touch a cow. He did not cut a fence. He would say that, later, over and over, as though it settled something. What he did was ride up the back of the mesa above the bell draw at 1 o'clock in the morning, with a slicker and a length of chain, into the little pasture on the bench where the crossbell kept its saddle stock, and find the old brown lead mare with the bell on her neck, and cut the bell off her. Then he opened the bench gate. Then he came through that pasture at a run behind 9 head of loose horses in the dark, popping the slicker and dragging the chain over rock. Horses in a dark pasture will run from a slicker. They will not run far. They circle, and they come back, because the pasture is where the water is, and the gate is small, and horses are conservative animals. He knew that. Every man in that country knew it. So he ran them off the bench, and down the slope, and out through the gate, and onto 60 miles of open range, and then he did the thing that made it permanent. He rode after them for 4 miles in the dark, popping and dragging, until they were strung out and running blind, and had gone past every landmark they knew, and then he let them go, and turned around, and went home to the hatchet bunkhouse and slept. 9 head. The old brown lead mare with 11 years of knowing the way home, and the bell off her neck lying in the grass on the bench. The 4 green 4-year-olds. The old bay pony with the splint, 2 solid using horses, and a little dun that Abel had broken in 1880. Tobe woke at the noise and got out to the barn with 1 boot on and no lantern. And in the dark in the yard he got hit by something moving, he never knew what, a horse or a man on a horse, and went down against the corner of the water trough and broke 2 ribs and lay there. Hannah found him at 4 in the morning. She had been asleep in her clothes for the first time in 9 days. She got him inside. She got him on the bed, and got his shirt off him, and bound the ribs with a strip of sheet, and got whiskey into him, and he swore at her and gripped her wrist and said, "The horses, girl, never mind me, the horses." And she said, "I know," and went out into the yard in the gray light. The bench gate stood open. The little pasture was empty. There was nothing on it in any direction, no horse, no dust, no sound, all the way to the rimrock. Hannah Calloway stood in the middle of her own yard on the morning of the 7th of October, 1884, with 210 head of cattle in a trap, $1,400 owing, 7 days left, 1 man in the house who could not sit up, and not 1 horse in the world. Then something moved at the corner of her eye, down at the corral by the barn. She turned around. The big dark bay was standing at the corral gate, with his head over the top rail, looking at her. He had been standing there, she found out later from the way the ground was tracked, for most of an hour since a little after 3, which was when the noise on the bench would have stopped. He had not run. 9 horses had gone off the bench above him at a dead run in the dark, with a chain dragging and a slicker popping, and every hoof and every crack and every terrified whinny of it had gone out across that draw, and it had gone through him and past him and around him and into the country beyond, and it had never once gone into him. because there was nothing in him for it to go into. He had felt them go. He had gone to the gate to see about it. And when the thing he could not hear had finished happening, he had stood at the gate and waited all night in the cold for somebody to come out of the house and show him what to do next. Hannah walked across the yard. She came around the corner of the corral into his eye, because she never once forgot it, not even then, and she put both hands flat on the sides of his face, and she put her forehead against the flat bone between his eyes, and stood like that for a while with her shoulders going. "They took the bell off the mare," she said, into his face, to a horse who could not hear one word of it, "and they left me the only one who was never listening for it." She rode into Hackberry Wells on the 8th, on the only horse she had, and she went to the bank first, because the bank was the thing that could not wait. Ephraim Deal was a decent man in the way that bankers are permitted to be decent, which is inside a fence. He heard her out with his hands folded on the desk, and he was genuinely sorry, and he said no. "The note comes current on the 14th, he said, "and it isn't mine. It was the Territorial's, out of Cheyenne. He held it and serviced it, and could not move it by one day, and if he could have, he would have." He had watched what she had done in 3 weeks, and he had said so at his own supper table. "Say it in the street." Deal flushed. "That isn't fair." "No," Hannah agreed. "It isn't. I'm past fair. I'm at what works." She stood up. "How much do 240 steers bring at the cars on the 14th? The buyer's paying $22 a head for good beef stuff off grass, and $18 for the plain." Deal did the arithmetic he had already done twice that morning. 240 at $18 is $4,320. You'd clear the note and have a year in your hand, and a good deal more than a year. And 210? 210 at $18 is $3,780. He looked up. "You would still clear it." Hannah stopped with her hand on the back of the chair. "Say that again." "You'd clear it with 210. With 190. With 160. Deal spread his hands. The 240 was never the bank's number. It was Abel's number, off a tally book in 1882, when beef was $11 a head. She had been running herself into the ground for 3 weeks against a figure that had stopped being true 2 years before. "I assumed you knew," Deal said, "and I'm ashamed of it. If you'd asked me in September, I'd have told you in a minute." Hannah stood very still in the middle of a bank in a torn blue dress, and did the sum that changed the shape of everything. "Then, I don't need 30 more head," she said. "No, ma'am, I need to get 210 head 41 miles. "Yes, ma'am," said Ephraim Deal, "and I would not have said that was the easier half until about 4 days ago." She went out into the street and stood on the boardwalk in the sun with her hand on Sunday's neck for a full minute, and then she started to laugh, and then she stopped, because the second part of it had arrived. 41 miles. 210 head of half-wild grass cattle that had been gathered off open range by force in 17 days. 3 days on the trail. 1 woman. 1 man with 2 broken ribs who could not sit a horse. And 1 horse. You cannot trail 210 head with 1 rider. Not 41 miles. Not across the 6-mile flat. Not in the same 3 days that 6,000 head of Cadence County beef would be moving over the identical ground to the identical cars. A rider works a point or a swing or drag, and a herd that size wants 5, and it wants a horse change at noon. And it wants somebody awake all night. She was standing there working through it when Gus Prine came out of the mercantile with a parcel and stopped, and the 2 women looked at each other across 15 feet of boardwalk. "I heard about your horses," Gus said. "That was low." Hannah said nothing. "I want you to understand I had no part in it, and neither did my husband," Gus went on. And her chin was up, and Hannah realized with genuine surprise that the woman was frightened. "Gus has been fit to be tied since yesterday morning. He has had every hand on the place in the office one at a time." She adjusted her grip on the parcel. I have said things about you in this town that I am not going to be able to take back by being pleasant on a boardwalk, so I won't try. But I did not want that. Mrs. Prine, Hannah's voice was flat and tired. The pen's at the loading chute. Who's got them booked for the 14th? Idalia's face closed like a hand. The hatchet has the chute from the morning of the 13th, she said. We booked it in August. That is not a trick. It is a book at a railroad office, and there are 6,000 head in this district trying to get on 40 cars. How long will 1,100 head take to load? 1,100 head takes most of a day. And the last train pulls when? 4 o'clock on the 14th, said Idalia Prine. And then, after a moment, more quietly, there is a second chute at the north end. It is old, and the wing fence is down on the west side, and nobody has used it since '81. Hannah looked at her. Why tell me that? Because I have a great deal of pride, Idalia said, and it turns out that it will let me watch a woman be beaten by a vote, and it will not let me watch her be beaten by a man with a chain in the dark. She started away and stopped. Fix the wing fence. And Mrs. Calloway, you will need riders. I know. Then I would go and ask for some, Idalia said. And I would not do it the way you have done everything else this month, which is alone. Willa Stroud came up the bell draw at noon on the 9th, with 2 hands, 6 saddle horses, and a wagon. She was 58, wide, weathered to the color of a saddle, and she had run the Stroud place since her husband died in 1876, and she had voted for Hannah in the back room in September, and had said one sentence in that meeting, and then shut up, and she had been ashamed of the shutting up ever since. She pulled the wagon into the yard and climbed down and looked at the empty bench pasture and the torn-up ground. You didn't ask, she said. No, well, I didn't wait to be asked, so we're square. Willa jerked her thumb at the 2 hands, who were already unhitching. That's Anders Vega, and that's his brother Marco, and they have worked cattle since they were 11 years old, and they are better than anything Prine's got, and he wouldn't hire them, which is his misfortune, and now it is my good luck. 6 horses. Where's your cattle? Hannah opened her mouth and found she could not do anything with it. Oh, don't, Willa said. Alarmed, don't you dare. I have not got the constitution for it. Caleb Doyle rode in at dark with his bedroll on the back of his saddle and 2 horses on a lead, which is how a man in that country tells you he no longer has a job. He fire you? Hannah asked. No, ma'am. I quit at noon. Over the horses? Over the horses. Caleb got down and stood holding his reins. One thing, and then I'd like to get to work. Prine didn't order it. He had known the man 9 years, and would have quit him just as fast if he thought he had. What Gus Prine had done was spend 3 weeks letting a whole county understand that Hannah Calloway was a thing that could be pushed on, and then act surprised when somebody pushed. Caleb looked at the ground. There's a lot of that in the world, he said, and most of it never gets its name said out loud. They pulled out of the bell draw at daylight on the 11th of October with 210 head. Hannah rode point on Sunday. Anders and Marco Vega took the swings. Caleb Doyle rode drag, which is the worst job on any drive, and which he took without being asked and did not mention. Willa Stroud drove the wagon with Tobe Riddle propped up on the seat beside her, strapped around the chest, swearing steadily at the state of the world, holding the lines when she needed both hands. They made 15 miles the first day and bedded on the dry bench above the 6-mile crossing. They made 14 the second and came down onto the flat at 4 in the afternoon on the 12th. And when they came over the last roll and Hannah saw what was in front of her, she pulled up and sat there. The 6-mile flat is 3 miles wide and 5 long, and it is the only water between the latter rim and Hackberry Wells, and every outfit in Cadence County that was shipping that year had come to the same water in the same 3 days. There were cattle on that flat from one side to the other. The Broken Arrow had 900 head on the north end. The Lazy J had 600 below them. There were 3 smaller outfits strung along the creek with 400 apiece. And down at the south end, on the best of the water, with 14 riders around them and a wagon and a remuda of 60 horses, stood 1,100 head of hatchet beef steers, the biggest single bunch of cattle that had been held on that flat since 1879. Something over 4,000 head of cattle in one basin, on one water, on the night of the 12th of October. Caleb Doyle came up alongside her at the point, and they both looked at it for a while. "That's a lot of cattle in one place," Hannah said. "That's a lot of cattle in one place," Caleb agreed. Then he turned his head and looked west at the latter rim 14 miles off, where the sun was going down behind a bank of cloud that had been building since noon and had gone the color of a bruise along the bottom. "Ma'am," he said, "how did that dry storm on the 30th come up?" "Out of the west," Hannah said. "Off the rim." They sat their horses and watched the cloud, and neither of them said anything else. And behind them 210 head of cross-bell cattle came down onto the 6-mile flat in the last of the light. They did a wise thing that evening, and it saved them, and it was Tobe Riddles from a wagon seat with 2 broken ribs in about 11 words. "Don't bet on the flat," he said. "Get behind the point." The point was a low spur of rock and gravel that came off the west side of the basin and ran out into the flat about half a mile 12 or 14 feet high, with a bench of good grass behind it and a slough of standing water at the foot. It was poor betting ground because it was small and the water was bad. It was excellent betting ground because nothing on that flat could come through it. They put 210 head of cross-bell cattle in behind the point at dusk on the 12th, in a pocket, with a wall of rock between them and 4,000 head of other people's cattle, and Anders Vega rode the first watch, and Hannah took the second. The storm came at 20 minutes past 11. It came the way the one on the 30th had come, and it came bigger. She had been watching it walk down off the latter rim for 2 hours, a black wall from the ground to the top of the sky, with lightning going inside it like something alive in a sack, and it came across those 14 miles in an hour and a half, and it hit the 6-mile flat with a wind that laid the grass flat and took the cook's fly off the Broken Arrow wagon in one piece. Then it rained, hard, straight down, and then it hailed. Hail is the thing. Everybody who tells the story of a stampede tells about the thunder, and thunder is part of it, but any man who has been in one will tell you it is the hail that does it, because hail hurts. 4,000 head of cattle, standing in the open on the 6-mile flat, got hit, all at once, with ice the size of a thumb joint, driven flat by 40 miles of wind. And over the top of it the sky came apart. Not a crack. There was no crack in it anywhere. It was one continuous falling over roar that went on for a minute and a half at a stretch, with the flat lit blue-white every few seconds, and the rock of the point standing out black, and then gone. And the whole world shaking down through the ground into the feet of everything standing on it. The hatchet herd went at 11:41. Somebody counted the minutes off a watch afterward, and everybody agreed on it, the way men do about the one thing in a disaster they can be exact about. 1,100 beef steers came off that bed ground as one body and went north up the flat. Hannah felt it before she heard it, through Sunday, who had stopped grazing and lifted his head and gone rigid under her a full 4 seconds before the noise arrived, pointing south into the dark at nothing, the way he had pointed at brush all through September. Then it arrived. 1,100 head at a run is not a sound. It is weather. It came up the flat, and the ground under the point began to move. A low, fast shuddering that came up through the rock into a horse's feet and then into a woman's knees, and the lightning went, and Hannah Calloway saw the whole of it in one blue-white second like a photograph. 1,100 cattle running north across 3 miles of open flat, with their heads down and their tails up. And beyond them the Broken Arrow's 900 already coming off their bedground to join it, and beyond that the Lazy J, and beyond that 2 wagons and 30 men asleep on the ground in bedrolls, and beyond all of it, at the north end of the basin, the place where the 6 Mile came out of the flat and dropped 20 feet into a rock channel over a cutbank 1.5 miles long. Everything on that flat was going to go into that channel, 4,000 head. And in front of it, in the way, in the dark, were the camps. She swung Sunday around the end of the point and looked south, and the second flash showed her the rest of it, and the rest of it was the part nobody who was there ever forgot. 14 hatchet riders and a remuda of 60 horses, and not one man mounted and moving. The remuda had broken. 60 loose horses were going north up the flat in front of the cattle in a mass. The 2 nightmen had been thrown in the first 15 seconds, both of them, and the whole camp was on foot in the rain and the dark, trying to catch and saddle horses that were gone, and the men who did have a horse could not do a thing with it, because every horse in that basin was out of its mind. She saw one man get up 3 times on a horse that went over backward twice. She saw Gus Prine himself, hatless, in his shirt, hanging on a lead rope with both hands and both heels dug in, while a good $150 gelding dragged him 20 feet through the mud. That was the picture. 4,000 cattle running at a cutbank, 30 men asleep in the path, and the richest outfit in Cadence County standing in the mud with 60 horses and not one of them any use to anybody, because every one of them could hear the sky. Hannah Calloway put her hand flat on the neck of a deaf horse and held it there. "All right," she said. She could have gone the other way. She thought about that for the rest of her life, and she was always honest about it, which is rare. She said that she did think about it, for about as long as it takes to breathe out. Her cattle were safe behind the point. Her note was covered. Every single thing she had bled for through 27 days was standing in a rock pocket 100 yards behind her, and the men whose herd was running were the men who had voted her out of the roundup, and the man dragging through the mud on the end of a lead rope had offered her $6 to walk away from her own horse in front of 40 people. She thought about it for one breath. Then she rode Sunday out from behind the point and turned him south, into the dark, alone, straight at 1,100 running cattle. Here is what she understood, and what nobody else on that flat could have acted on even if they had understood it. In a stampede at night, nobody can hear anything. That is the whole tragedy of the thing. 14 good men were on that flat, and even if every one of them had been mounted on the best horse of his life, they could not have worked together, because a man cannot shout to another man 30 feet away over 1,100 running cattle and a sky falling over. Cowhands ran stampedes on sound, a shot, a shout, a slap chap, the point man's voice going out along the lead. All of it was gone. The noise had eaten it. Every man out there was alone inside a wall of sound, and the horses under them were being taken apart by that same sound, second by second. Hannah Calloway had spent 27 days learning to work a horse in absolute silence. She had a language that did not use sound and did not need sound, and had never once in its life been carried by sound. Flat palm, fist, 2 fingers to the shoulder and sweep. Hand on the neck, held still. It worked in a library, and it worked at the bottom of the loudest place in the territory, and it worked exactly the same in both, and she was the only human being in North America that night for whom that was true. And under her was a horse for whom the loudest place in the territory was not loud at all. She came down the west side of the flat at a run, on the outside of the herd, in the mud, in the hail, with the lightning going. She could not see the ground. She quit trying. She gave him his head entirely and rode with her weight forward and both hands down, and let a horse who had spent his whole life reading the earth through his feet pick 3,000 yards of black ground at 25 miles an hour. And he never put a foot wrong, not once. She got up along the flank, then the shoulder. Then, at the north end of the second mile, with the cut bank a half-mile ahead and coming, she got up level with the lead. The lead was 40 or 50 big steers running abreast with their heads low, and they were not thinking, and they were not going to think. And the only thing on God's earth that turns a running herd is a bigger fear on one side than the other. Hannah took Sunday in against the shoulder of the lead steers and started to press. It is a thing that has to be done at speed, from a horse's length away, over and over, leaning into them with the horse's shoulder and the flat of the slicker and the weight of the animal underneath you. And it works or it does not work, and if it does not work, you are under them. She had seen 2 men do it in her life. She had never done it. The first press did nothing. The second did nothing. The third moved the lead maybe 2 degrees, and she felt it, and screamed at the top of her lungs, at a horse who did not hear her, out of nothing but joy. She pressed them 11 minutes. The cut bank came up out of the dark on the 4th flash, and it was 400 yards off, and the lead had come around maybe a quarter of the way it needed to. She put her hand flat on his neck once. Nothing. This is nothing. I am here, and took him in tighter than she had any business taking him. Hard against them. Boot to horn in the wall of running cattle, close enough that a steer's horn came up under Sunday's neck and laid his shoulder open 8 inches, and he went on pressing exactly the same, because he had not the faintest idea that anything had happened, and would not have cared if he had. And the lead came around. It came around slow and then all at once, the way a herd does, the way water in a pan does when you tilt it. 1,100 steers swung west with 200 yards of the cut bank to spare, and then, because the country bent, and because a horse and a woman kept pressing, they came on around south, and then east, and the head of that herd ran into its own tail. That is a mill. Once a herd is milling, it is done. It runs in a circle and it runs the panic out of itself, and 20 minutes later it is 1,100 wet, exhausted steers walking in a ring in the rain, and men can get around it. They got around it at about midnight. By then there were riders, Caleb Doyle, who had come off the point 90 seconds behind her on the best horse he had, and had spent the whole 11 minutes trying to get up to the lead and never made it, because his horse would not face the noise. Anders and Marco Vega, 4 hatchet men who had finally got mounted, 2 of the broken arrows. They took the mill and held it, and turned it down and let it walk. Hannah rode Sunday out of the herd at a walk with her hat gone and her hair down, and one sleeve of the blue dress torn off at the shoulder, and she got 60 yards clear, and got down, and her legs would not hold her, and she sat down in the mud and the hail with the reins in her hand. The horse stood over her. The last of the storm went off east with the thunder falling over itself, and the rain came down straight and cold, and lightning lit up the 6-mile flat one more time and showed 4,000 head of cattle standing still. Gus Prine came up on foot. He had walked 1.5 miles in the mud in his shirt sleeves in the dark, because there had never been a horse for him. And he came up out of the rain and stopped 10 feet away and looked at a woman sitting in the mud and a big dark bay standing over her with his head down and a long open place on his shoulder and his sides going like a bellows. Prine did not say anything for a long time. Then he took his hat off, and there was no hat, and his hand went up and came down again empty. And he stood there in the rain, with 1,100 head of his cattle, alive behind him. They counted at first light on the 13th, and the numbers went around that flat all morning, and then went into town ahead of the cattle, and were the only thing anybody in Cadence County talked about for a month. 4,040 head of cattle had been on the 6-mile flat when the storm hit. 1,100 of them had run 2.5 miles at a dead run in the dark at a cut bank with 30 men asleep in the path. Nothing went over the cut. Nothing at all. They lost 9 head to the mud and the crush, and a broken arrow man had a broken collarbone, and the hatchet spent 2 days gathering 60 horses off 20 miles of country, and that was the whole of the damage. Willa Stroud sewed up the horse at 6 in the morning by lantern light in the back of a wagon, with the reins still coming off the canvas in a string. 22 stitches with a curved needle and waxed thread, and she did it well, having done it a great many times, and Hannah stood at his head with both hands flat on his face and her forehead against him, and he stood for it, without being held. "He'll carry a white streak there the rest of his life," Willa said, tying off. "Good," Hannah said. Caleb Doyle came around the wagon at 7 with his hat in his hand and a hatchet hand named Dowd behind him, and Dowd would not look at anybody, and it came out in about 40 seconds. Vernon Tack had come into the bunkhouse on the morning of the 7th with mud to the knee and a chain in his slicker roll, and had told 3 men what he had done and why, expecting, in the way of a certain kind of man, to be told he had done right. Nobody had said a word to him for 6 days. Then 1,100 head of the Hatchet's cattle had been turned off a cut bank at midnight by the horse he had left behind in the corral, and at 4 o'clock in the morning Dowd had walked 1.5 miles in the mud to find Caleb Doyle, because Caleb had quit, and therefore Caleb was the only man he could tell. Gus Prine heard it standing up, in a wet shirt, at 7:20 in the morning, in front of 20 men. He turned Vernon Tack off the place that hour, and paid him to the day, and told him to be out of Cadence County by the 20th, and then he did the other thing, which Hannah did not expect and never forgot. He walked over to the crossbell wagon in front of all of them, and said out loud, in a voice that carried, that the Hatchet would stand the loss of the horses. 9 head. Mrs. Calloway would name the price or take her pick out of his own remuda, whichever suited her. "And I'd take it as a favor if she picked," he said. "I'd rather she had good ones." "That's the Hatchet's loss to stand?" Hannah said. "Or yours?" Prine looked at her. "It's mine," he said. They came into Hackberry Wells at noon on the 14th of October with 210 head, and they came down the middle of the road, because there was no other way to bring cattle to the pens, and because at that point Hannah Calloway was not going around anybody. The town was out. All of it. The whole street was out, on both boardwalks, and up on the loading platform, and on the roof of the livery, and it was not a friendly crowd, and it was not an unfriendly one. It was the other thing, which is a crowd that has come to see whether a thing is true. The main chute had the Hatchet in it. 1,100 head take most of a day, and they had been loading since first light, and they were about half through, and there was no earthly way they would be done before 4 o'clock. The north chute had not been used since 1881. The wing fence was down on the west side, 60 feet of it, and without a wing you cannot put cattle up a chute. You can only stand there and watch them go around it. Hannah had 210 head, 3 hours, and 60 feet of fallen fence. She was 200 yards out and doing the arithmetic on it when she saw that there were men at the north chute already. There were about 25 of them. There was Fenno off the Lazy J with his shirt off, and 3 more Lazy J hands, and 4 men from the Broken Arrow, and Ephraim Deal the banker in his shirt sleeves with his coat on a post, and the smith from the livery, and 2 of Willa Stroud's neighbors, and a half-dozen men Hannah did not know by name, and had heard laugh at her at a sail ring on the 15th of September. They had been at it since 10 o'clock that morning, They had the wing fence back up and braced, and they were wiring the last of it. And somebody had cut brush and thrown it against the outside so the cattle would not see through. And when Hannah Calloway came down the road, at the point of 210 head of cattle on a big dark bay with 22 stitches in his shoulder, the men at the north chute stopped work and stood up and took their hats off. Not one of them cheered. That was the part she told about afterward. 25 men in a dusty street took their hats off and stood there holding them and did not make a sound, and it was, she said, considerably harder to bear than laughing. They loaded 210 head in an hour and 50 minutes. Ephraim Deal did the count off the platform himself with a tally book and a stub of pencil, calling it out, and the buyer's man walked the cars and graded them, and paid $19 a head for 168 of them, and $18 for the other 42. Because they were good cattle off good grass, and 27 days of being gathered by one woman had not hurt them a bit. $3,948. Deal took $1,400 of it against the note and wrote it paid and dated it the 14th of October, 1884, and handed her the paper on the loading platform with the last train under steam 40 feet away. And then, because he was a banker and could not help himself, he counted the rest into her hands in front of everybody, $2,548. Gus Prine came up the platform steps while she was still holding it. He had his hat this time, and he took it off. Mrs. Calloway. Mr. Prine. Two things, and then I'll get out of your way. He turned the hat around by the brim. First, the association meets the first Monday in November. He intended to move that the vote of the 15th of September be struck out of the book. He intended to move that the crossbell run its brand with the general roundup in the spring. And he intended to stand up in that room in front of the same 19 outfits and say that he had been wrong in his arithmetic and worse than wrong in the use he had made of it. I'd rather say it than have it said for me, he told her. And I'd have said it if you'd lost. Would you? I would, Prine said. Though I'll grant you a man can say anything after. And the second thing? Gus Prine looked past her at the horse, standing at the bottom of the platform steps with his head low, and the sun on the shaved white patch on his shoulder where 22 stitches lay in a line. $500, he said. The street heard it, the whole street heard it, and the sound the street made was not a laugh this time, it was a kind of low sound with no word in it. Because $500 for a saddle horse in Cadence County in 1884 was not an offer, it was an event. It was 2 years of a foreman's wages. It was more than any animal in that territory had ever brought that was not a racehorse or a bull. Hannah Calloway stood on a loading platform with $2,548 in her hands, and the note marked paid in her apron pocket, and 210 head of cattle in the cars behind her, and the whole town of Hackberry Wells looking up at her, and she took her time. No, she said. I'm not trying to take a thing from you. He had 4,000 head and 14 riders, and he had just spent a night standing in the mud, watching every horse he owned be useless. He wanted that horse because it was the best horse he had ever seen, and because he would not have had a herd that morning if it had not been in the county. He put the hat back on. Name a number, I'll meet it. There isn't a number. There isn't a number, Hannah agreed. Why? And this is the part that got repeated. From the platform to the boardwalk to the stove at the mercantile to the wagon at the spring roundup and out of the county altogether, and got repeated wrong 9 times out of 10. And the right version is the one 25 men with their hats in their hands heard her say. Because you had him, Hannah Calloway said. For 5 weeks. And you rode him in a book as a killer without ever laying eyes on him, and you ran him through the ring twice, and you'd have run him a 3rd time. And Otis Frame had him, and knew exactly what he was, and was still glad to get $140 for him. And a man in Ogallala had him, and got $60, and thought he'd done well. She looked down at the horse. There is nothing wrong with that animal. Mr. Prine there never was, one day of his life. The only thing that was ever wrong with him is that everybody who ever owned him needed to be able to holler at him, and when he couldn't be hollered at, they all decided the fault was his. Prine did not say anything. "You want to buy the horse?" Hannah said. "You still don't want to learn the language. And I am not going to sell an animal to a man who is going to stand behind him and shout." She came down the platform steps and around into his eye, the way she never once forgot to do, and put her hand flat on his nose and led him off down the middle of the street. The last stock train out of Hackberry Wells pulled at 4 o'clock on the 14th of October, 1884. With 210 head of crossbell cattle in the cars, and Hannah Calloway did not turn around to watch it go. She wintered 110 cows and a good bull in the bell draw, and she came out in the spring of 1885 with 96 calves on the ground, which was the best percentage in the district that year, and about which she was insufferable. She hired Anders and Marco Vega in November at $30 a month, which was $5 over the going wage, and got the 2 best hands in Cadence County for it, and kept them 11 years. Toe Brittle's ribs knitted crooked, and he complained about them until 1897, and rode until 1894. Willa Stroud came to supper the first Sunday of every month for the rest of her life, and the 2 women never once discussed what either of them had done for the other, having agreed without ever agreeing that it would be unbearable. The association met the first Monday in November, and Gus Prine did exactly what he had said he would do, in front of 19 outfits, standing up, and it cost him something, and everybody in the room knew it cost him something. The vote to strike went 19-0. The Crossbell ran its brand with the General Roundup in the spring of 1885, and every spring after. And Hannah Calloway sat on the association board from 1889 and was its president in 1896, the first woman in that territory to hold the office of anything. Otis Frame drilled his last well in 1886 and came to live in the little room off the tack shed at the Bell Draw, and spent 4 years teaching everybody who came through that yard how to walk around into a horse's eye, and died there in 1890 in the spring, and is buried up on the bench above the house where the saddle horses are. Caleb Doyle drew wages at the Crossbell for a year and a half, and did not once in all that time say anything at all about it, and then in the April of 1886 he took his hat off in the kitchen doorway, and said, "Ma'am, I have been standing in this yard for 18 months, and I would like to know if I am ever going to be anything besides a hand." And Hannah Calloway said, "You have not been a hand since the 9th of October. And if you had asked me in 1885, I would have said yes then too." And they were married in June by a preacher who came up from Hackberry Wells in a spring wagon. And the horse. The horse lived to be 26 years old. He was ridden every working day for 17 of them, and gathered cattle on the Ladder Rim country until he was 21. And he carried Hannah Calloway 30 miles in a night in 1891 to a doctor, and both of them lived. And he stood at the head of a well rig for Otis Frame one more time in 1887, when a charge went off 30 feet from him, and he lifted his head and looked at it mildly, and went back to his hay. Nobody in Cadence County ever called him a dummy horse again. They called him the Calloway horse, and then they just called him Sunday, and men brought colts to that yard for 20 years to be started by hand signals by a woman in a faded blue dress, and there got to be a certain kind of horseman in that country who did not raise his voice, and there still is. She never put a bell on him. She thought about it once, in the second winter, when he got out of the horse pasture in a fog, and it took her 4 hours to find him, and she stood in the barn with the old brown mare's bell in her hand, the one Vernon Tack had cut off in the dark and thrown in the grass, and that Marco Vega had found in the spring with a mower, and she turned it over twice and hung it back on the nail, because a bell is for calling a thing that is listening for you, And she had learned, at some cost in the fall of 1884, that the great trouble with this world is not the creatures that cannot hear us. It is that we will stand behind a thing our whole lives, shouting, and call it worthless when it does not turn around, and never once think to walk around to the front of it and be seen.